Well, hi everybody.
Like,
So tonight I started the show with the first of his sort of I refer to it as a grand polonaise, the F sharp minor polonaise, as to wet our beaks before we entered the four ballades, and it's um it's the ballades are some of the most significant works of Chopin's entire output. So, to hear Maniacs play them in one sweep is really a treat, to say the least. But I thought I would start with a rather long quote of Liszt describing the Polonaise in a very, how shall we say, Lisztian way. So here we go. In this form, the noblest traditional feelings of ancient Poland are represented. The Polonaise is the true and purest type of Polish national character, as in the course of centuries it was developed, partly through the political position of the kingdom toward east and west, partly through an undefinable, peculiar, inborn disposition of the entire race. In the development of the Polonaise, everything cooperated which specifically distinguished the nation from others. In the Poles of departed times, manly resolution was united with glowing devotion to the object of their love. Their knightly heroism was sanctioned by high soaring dignity, and even the laws of gallantry and the national costume exerted an influence over the turns of this dance. The Polonaises are the keystone in the development of this form. They belong to the most beautiful Chopin inspirations. With their energetic rhythm, they electrify to the point of excited demonstration, even the sleepiest indifferentism. Chopin was born too late and left his native hearth too early to be initiated into the original character of the Polonaise as dance through his own observation. But what others imparted to him in regard to it was supplemented by his fancy and his nationality. So here again, Liszt is giving this grandiose picture of what exactly captures the Polish spirit in these dance forms, and saying, that Chopin was, born too late. In other words, he wasn't experiencing the actual dance, but pulling from the national feeling of what Liszt interprets as the Polish sensibility. A polonaise is a in three, a dance in three, like many dances are. It's sort of moderately paced, and it has an emphasis on the second beat. It's either in binary form, which we've looked at pieces in binary form. That means it has two themes, or ternary form, which means it has two themes and a trio, just like a scherzo. So we have this F sharp minor polonaise, and Liszt says that of this particular polonaise, he says, it is a dream poem, the lurid hour that precedes a hurricane with a convulsive shudder at the close. He's got that last burst of energy and angst at the end of this polonaise. And Hunziker, the biographer, also said it's a confession from the dark depths of the self-tortured soul. And this is why the Polonaise carries the moniker of tragic. Again, Chopin did not ascribe that moniker to this Polonaise, and I'm not even sure that it was published as tragic, but it was ascribed the nickname tragic because of the mood of the piece. But the F sharp minor polonaise is in the latter of the two forms. It's in ternary form, and as I said in the show, he puts a mazurka in the middle of the polonaise very strangely. So he changes the dance style in the second theme of the polonaise, acting as sort of a trio as a mazurka, which was highly inventive, very interesting. What did we think of Blehash's interpretation of this polonaise? Nods.
I was shoveling snow.
You're shoveling snow. I mean, again, Blehash brings out these colors and the sensibility. We talked about, does one need to be Polish in order to play these in a certain way? But he certainly has this character that's very, very instilled in his playing. It's quite extraordinary. And I thought we should listen to another Polonaise. And this one is a famous one. It's the A major Polonaise, Opus 41, number 1, the military Polonaise. And I have a performance with Blayhosh again. And this performance is in WNYC in New York. They have a space called the Green Space. And Blayhosh, when he won the Gilmore Award, he was invited by WQXR. I said NYC, but it's QXR, sorry, QXR, to play at the space. And I actually went down and was in attendance. It's a space that's maybe 100 seats, no, maybe even 75 seats, very small, intimate space. So let's hear Raphael Blayhosh, the military Polonaise. Here we go. What'd you think?
Made me want to get up and march around the room if I knew how to march in 3.
His use again of as we saw in other performances of his, of the rubatos, the timing, the pauses, the length of the notes, the shaping of the phrases in terms of the rhythms is really very, very extraordinary. I think it's what gives it such life and such character. It's really idiomatic to the music.
It reminds me of the horses on display in Vienna. They march to that
melody.
third.
Yeah, I like that. That's great. Yeah, I mean, what David was speaking to, it never sounds contrived. You know, these where he takes the time and the pacing, and maybe he's hanging on the back of the beat a little bit, and then he's marching forward in the beat. It's always very, very natural and wonderful. And I have to say, the acoustic in this space, this is basically a room with glass. It's the ground floor of WQXR's building. The acoustic's not great. There wasn't a lot of a ringing, a nice ring in this room, but you get a sense of his playing. I mean, and what I think and why I bring him back to the series almost every other year. It's that he brings something very special to the repertoire, especially in Chopin. And then we move to the ballades. We looked at the fantasy, and I spoke about the last week, and I spoke about the major works and the longer works of Chopin, and the ballades are some of his most significant works. And as I said in the show, that he created the musical ballade. The ballade in poetry at the time was very popular, and he just decided to make it his own and tell a story through the piano. But Chopin didn't really tell a distinctive story. It was very, very different from others of his time, like, for instance, who was obsessed with telling a specific story? Which composer? Anyone? Oh, David,
I said Wagner or Liszt.
Liszt, Mr. Liszt. We're talking about program music. Program music, telling a distinct story within the music. So rather than telling the story as Liszt had done, where he's painting a specific scene, and if you recall, we did listen to a Liszt ballade, I believe the B minor ballade, which had this sort of vampire-like story of the dead horseman taking the woman off to her grave. And the music will depict exactly that, but Chopin not so much. It's an allusion to an emotion rather than specific literal translation of what's happening in the music. I have a couple quotes. Friedrich Niecks, who was German, he was a German composer and biographer in the 19th century, and he wrote the most important biography of Chopin in the German language. And he said, "None of Chopin's compositions surpasses in masterliness of form and beauty and poetry of his ballades. In them, he attains the acme of his power as an artist." Another a critic, German, 19th century German critic and composer Louis Ehlert wrote, "Each one differs entirely from the others, and they have but one thing in common, their romantic working out and the nobility of their motives. Chopin relates in them not like one who communicates something really experienced. It is as though he told what never took place, but what has sprung up in his inmost soul, the anticipation of something longed for." Again, not a specific story, but what's within him and emotions that are coming up out of him. It's as I said in the show, it took 5 years for him to compose the first ballade. It's seemingly he's trying to work out the idea of what what a ballade is going to be in this first ballade in G minor. Schumann, I wanted to reiterate the quote that I used in the show because it's an important one. Schumann said, "It seems to me to be the work closest to his genius. I told him that of everything he has created thus far, it appeals to my heart the most." And Chopin replied, "I am glad because I too like it the best. It is my dearest work." High praise, high praise. And Louis Ehlert, who I just quoted, said, "Perhaps the most touching of all that Chopin has written is the tale of the F major ballade. I've witnessed children lay aside their games to listen thereto. It appears like some fairy tale that has become music." So it's really, you know, these ballades were really taken by the musicians and listeners alike of the time. And Manny, again, we talk about Manny and his mastery of most things, but Chopin especially. We've been hearing a lot of Manny in these Chopin shows, and I think, you know, this concert was 2005, so 15 years ago. Really, Manny in the real pinnacle of his career, playing this repertoire. It's such a treat to hear. And then we have the second one, the second in F major, which was dedicated to Schumann. And Schumann, the dedication was in response to Schumann dedicating his Chrysleriana, Opus 16, to Chopin. So he did it in response to that dedication. But when the music arrived to Schumann, he had reservations about it. He had reservations about the piece. He said, "A less artistic work than the first. Its impassioned episodes seem to have been afterward inserted. I recollect very well that when Chopin played this ballade for me, it finished in F major. It now closes in A minor." So he was a little bit about this ballade when it was. He was pleased that it was dedicated to him, and I mentioned a quote on the show about that. But as far musically speaking, he preferred the first one to the second one. And Niecks says, again, the German biographer, he said, "The second ballade possesses beauties in no way inferior to those of the first. What can be finer than the simple strains of the opening section? They sound as if they had been drawn from the people's storehouse of song." So he was defending Chopin in response to Schumann's assessment of this piece. The pianist Rubinstein, I made an allusion in the show to Rubinstein talking about a floating flower that falls, you know, laying sort of torn asunder on the ground. But I wanted to read the full quote of Anton Rubinstein because it's very, paints a lovely picture. He says, "Is it possible that the interpreter does not feel the necessity of representing to his audience a field of flied flowers caught by a gust of wind, a caressing of the flower by the wind, the resistance of the flower, the stormy struggle of the wind, the entreaty of the flower, which at last lies there broken, and paraphrased, the field flower a rustic maiden, the wind a knight." So again, these romantic musicians of the Romantic period, you know, giving a very, very flowery and sort of picturesque description of it. But he likened the theme of a floating flower just going along and then hitting struggle in the middle and then finally collapsing at the end from all the freneticism at the end of the second ballade. Really, really interesting assessment of it. The third ballade, the A flat major, it was composed in 1841. As I said in the show, Chopin goes in a completely different direction from the other ballades, where these first two ballades had this sort of overtly mysterious and I'd say sort of angst-filled darkness, touches of darkness. This one is particularly sunny, and he strays from the binary and ternary form and actually has three distinct themes in the third ballade, which was innovative on his own form. And this ballade is sometimes nicknamed Undine, which refers to a poem by a Polish poet, Adam Mickiewicz. And it was supposed that Chopin pulled a program from this poem. And tried as I may to find this poem, I could not find this poem. But then I discovered that scholars do not feel that this is pulled from poetry, and it would stick with Chopin's general aversion to having a program in his music. So I couldn't really, I wanted to find the poem to see if I could discern some sort of program, but then I saw that the scholars really did not feel that that was warranted, that ascribing this poem to this particular work made any sense. But James Hunsaker, the biographer, says, the episodical nature of this ballade is the fruit of the esoteric moods of its composer. It follows a hidden story and has the quality of great unpremeditated art. It shocks one by its abrupt, by no means fantastic transitions. The key color is changeful and the fluctuating themes are well contrasted. So again, these ballades they're episodic in nature and sort of are pulling from different emotions, different emotional states throughout these ballades. Really extraordinary works. It's hard to, describe these ballades when it's not fresh in our ear. I understand that, and it's for me to play some of they're long, so I didn't want to go back and intersperse sound samples from this. But the last ballade is perhaps one of the most significant pieces of music that Chopin ever wrote. He wrote it over the course of 2 years in Nohant. And this was in 1842 and 1843. And he and Georges Sand were still doing okay. And his health had not deteriorated quite as much yet. And as I'd mentioned in previous shows, in Nohant, they welcomed many very esteemed visitors, and the painter Delacroix being one of them. And I have a quote from Delacroix from Nohant in 1842 when this piece was written, just giving a general sense of the scene at Nohant. And he says, "The host could not have been more pleasant in entertaining me. When we are not all together at dinner, lunch, playing billiards, or walking, each of us stays in his room, reading or lounging around a couch. Sometimes through the window which opens on the garden, a gust of music wafts up from Chopin at work. All this mingles with the songs of the nightingales and the fragrance of roses." So it's a very idyllic setting in Nohant, and that's why Chopin used it as his main place of composition. But I forget in the show the ballade where he was the Sand quote where he was being frustrated by his work. Which ballade is it? I can't remember. But he was getting Chopin pounding at the piano from his frustrations in his work on the composition, which I found very interesting. I have another quote from Hunsaker about this particular F minor ballade. "There is passion, refined and swelling, in the curves of this most eloquent composition. It is Chopin at the supreme summit of his art, and an art alembricated, personal and intoxicating. I know of nothing in music like the F minor ballade. Its inaccessible position preserves it from rude and irreverent treatment. Its witchery is irresistible." I mean, it closes, if we recall from the show, it closes in this hyperkinetic, frenetic, and I described it as stress and anxiety from the composer. It's something that's so extraordinary and so much in contrast to the beautiful theme. And he just goes off in this freneticism at the keyboard. I assume that we enjoyed Maniacs's Chopin ballades. I may give a little hint that Manny may be with us next season playing Chopin. So look forward to it. But the ballade carried on in music history. There are other composers that have ballades. Can anybody name a composer that wrote a ballade, a musical ballade? No one wants a shiny nickel? Gary.
Yeah, as you told me last time, George Crumb. I think.
No, that's a
Was that- No, that was a
berceuse.
berceuse.
That's a
I'm sorry,
berceuse.
berceuse, whatever it is. I can't speak French. Forget it. You're right. Forget it.
Forget it. Steve.
I thought it was Liszt.
Well, Liszt. Certainly I mentioned Liszt, yes. Liszt wrote ballades directly after Chopin. We actually, way back when, heard a ballade from another composer, famous composer. One of the three Bs, Mr. Brahms. But also Debussy wrote a ballade, Fauré. I actually found some ballades. I was going to play one by Frank Martin. Do we know Frank Martin? French composer, early 20th century composer, very overlooked composer, wonderful, wonderful composer, great music. And he wrote ballades. He wrote several ballades for flute and piano, clarinet and piano, saxophone and piano, which is very interesting. But Mr. Brahms wrote an early work, the Opus 10 ballades, 4 ballades, that we listened to way back when we looked at Brahms in June, I believe. And again, these ballades didn't really have a program to them for the most part, but I wanted to play one of these ballades. And Brahms wrote these ballades in 1854, which is only 12 years after the fourth ballade of Chopin. So I wanted to play a recording for you of Michelangelo playing the second ballade in D major. So here is Michelangelo playing Brahms' second ballade, B major and D major, sorry. Here we go.
The two most
What'd you think of that?
I thought it was in the same overall spirit or overarching spirit of Chopin, but not to say anything against Brahms ever, but much more workmanlike, without that just ineffable je ne sais quoi that Chopin always has. I don't know, that was my take.
Yeah. David?
The I just to piggyback on what Delaney was saying, the Chopin is so immediately recognizable. I mean, a lot of composers you can tell who they are, but almost you hear one measure of it, and you know that it's Chopin. And when you can talk about the moods and the emotions, etc., but just the sound, as soon as you hear, you know that it's Chopin. There's a uniqueness about it that's, for me, more than almost anyone else. I mean, you know, with Bach you hear it right away too, but it's something extraordinary about Chopin in that way.
Yeah, I mean, on an earlier show, I did a show of the Iconoclasts, and I even my early show in Chopin was the French Iconoclast, with good reason. You're definitely right, you know, that he did this. Brahms wrote that. That's Opus 10. He was 21 years old when he wrote that piece. And it's funny that you know, that this particular ballade, you know, harkens to the later Klavierstücke, you know, in the Opus 118, which also does have one ballade in it. You know, that sort of, it's wistful, but there are similarities in form. This particular ballade, how many themes were there? Delaney says 3, and yes, I agree. So this is similar to the third ballade of Chopin, and the form of when Chopin and Brahms utilize 3 themes. It's A, then the B, the second theme, then C, then B, then A. So it's a palindromic form there. And it's just, you know, he uses the same structure that Chopin had, and Brahms was well aware of the Chopin ballades when he wrote these. You know, and they're really, you know, those ballades are rarely done. When we listened to them previously on the Zoom, Paul Lewis had played them on the series. I forget how many years ago, maybe 4 years ago. And they're just not done very often. And this particular performance of Michelangelo, it's a late performance. He was an older man there, and his performance style is very interesting, isn't it? Where it's just sort of, he's got just that stoic look on his face, but what he's doing is amazing. But he took the tempo of the first theme was quite slow.
Yep.
Quite slow. And not only slow, but also, as I've said about, we were speaking about Ballades, about the back of the beat and the front of the beat. He was on the way back of the beat. It was almost like you're waiting for the next note to sort of happen, which creates, you know, a tension in that. It's a beautiful, you know, it's a beautiful performance. It's not how, if I were to be playing it, that probably wouldn't be my approach, but I really enjoyed his interpretation of it.
He also uses in his technique, he uses a particularly low wrist, doesn't he?
Yes, he does.
And I noticed that in watching the hands.
Yeah, I think a couple shows ago, I don't know, Gary, if you listened to it, of the Ravel, the Gaspard de la Nuit, if you ever hear his technique was extraordinary, Michelangelo. I mean, just phenomenal technique. And he didn't like to perform very much. It was, you know, to have video of him performing, which is why I chose it instead of playing Paul's performance from our series, just an audio file. It's a treat. I mean, he was such an incredible artist, incredible pianist. Any other thoughts about tonight? Well, thank you. We have our final Chopin show next week, where we are listening to a slew of etudes. And then we're going to close with the A flat major Polonaise, the heroic Polonaise.
Mhm.
So we'll see you next week, everybody.
Point of
Thank
per-
you.
Thank you again.
Have a good night.
personal privilege, Derek. I probably will not be able to be with everybody next week. I'm having shoulder surgery that day, so I probably won't get there in time, but I'll be
Oh
back
dear.
2 weeks.
Aw, good luck.
All right. Well, good luck with that, David.
Thank you.
Best of
Care,
luck,
all
David.
right?
Yeah.
Keep
wow.
well.
All right. Yeah. Stay well. Okay.
Yeah.
All right, everybody. Good night.
Right.
Good night.
Care.
It was an absolutely gorgeous program, Derek, to hear all
Thanks.
four
Thanks.
ballades. And
Thanks, Dylan.
it blew me away.
Thank you. Thanks.